Hi, good morning. I welcome all of you. My name is Rahul Satra. I'm the president of the KUFA. Sorry, my headphones have fallen down. Just a moment, please. Uh, I'm also an associate professor in the Department of English at Ryerson University. Let me start by thanking all of you for being here today for the 2020 Worldviews Lecture, The Myth of Meritocracy, From Satire to Social Inequality. I would like to begin with the Land Acknowledgement. In the light of the findings and recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report, and the importance of recognizing the contributions of First Nations to our past and to our present, we'll begin our event with a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking to you today from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. And it is now home to many diverse nations, Inuit and Métis people. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the William Treaty, signed with the multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. This territory is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wempool Bend Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. The dish, or sometimes it is called the bowl, represents what is now Ontario, the Great Lakes to Quebec, from Lake Simcoe into the US. We all eat out of the dish. All of us share this territory with only one spoon. This means we have to share the responsibility of ensuring the dish is never empty, which includes taking care of the land and the creatures we share it with. Thanks. As the meeting is taking place online, I want to acknowledge that many Indigenous communities continue to lack access to internet and other infrastructure needed to participate in online events such as this one. Social inequalities and colonial practices continue to manifest in the ways in which we interact with each other, access work, services, and also talk to and deal with and connect with our community. And nothing has made this more clear than the COVID-19 pandemic, as most of us know. We're in a moment that requires us to reevaluate the system that are upheld with antiquated and flawed ideas around merit, which have been brought to the fore of public discourses by rallies and protests against anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism. Organizers of these movements are actively countering discourses of merit and meritocracy in their fight for Black and Indigenous lives across the world. The conversations here today come at a time when we're being asked to trouble, dismantle, undermine our notions of meritocracy, and instead consider the real material impacts of the discourse on different communities. Thanks a lot for that. Just some housekeeping items. Before we start, there'll be a Q&A session for the panelists towards the end of the lecture. If you have questions you would like to ask, please type them into the Q&A box located at the bottom of the screen. You can see it right there. If you have any questions, please do ask us. And our moderator will attempt to answer as many questions as time allows, but please feel free to ask as many questions that you may have. I would now like to welcome OISE Professor and Dean Glenn Jones to say a few words. So I would welcome Professor Dean Jones.
Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the organizing committee to this 2020 Worldviews Lecture. This is the 6th Worldviews Lecture, and the Worldviews project actually goes back more than a decade. The idea for this and the leadership largely came from the Ontario Confederation of University Faculty Associations, and the notion initially was to focus on the intersection between higher education and the media, and to use that intersection as a way of facilitating conversation on some of the great controversial and challenging issues that both higher education and the media have faced. We held conferences in 2011, 2013, and 2019. And in the intervening years, we've held these lectures, and this is a way to stimulate important conversations on key issues that are facing higher education in its current extremely challenging context. So my thanks to the organizing group that has included the Ontario Confederation of University Faculty Associations, and my particular thanks to Rahul Saprov, the president of the association, and to Mark Rosenfeld, the interim director, who played such an important leadership role in this process. The Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, and especially the Center for the Study of Canadian and International Higher Education, and we've been very pleased to be part of these organizing organizing these very important conversations, and as well as Inside Higher Education, University World News, and more recently the participation of the academic group and Goldblatt Partners. So my thank you very much for participating in this. Like others, I'm looking forward to this really important and I think extremely thoughtful conversation, given the tremendous breadth and strength of scholarship associated with our participants. And I'll turn things back over to Rahul to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Glenn. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Joe Littler, the professor in the Department of Sociology and the director of the Gender and Sexuality Research Center at City, University of London, UK. Her work on inequality and cultural politics is wide-ranging and include books such as Against Meritocracy, Culture, Power, and Myths of Mobility that came out in 2018. Another book, Radical Consumption, Shopping for Change in Contemporary Culture, which came out in 2008. Yet another one, The Politics of Heritage, The Legacies of Race, co-authored with Roshi Naidu in 2005. She's also the co-editor of the European Journal of Cultural Studies and part of the editorial collective of Soundings, a journal of politics and culture. Her current book projects include The Care Manifesto, co-written with Andrea Shetzakas, Jamie Hakim, Catherine Rottenberg, and Lynn Siegel, and also a book of interviews with left feminist academics. So please join me in welcoming Professor Joe Littler. Thank you. Joe, I would hand it over to you now.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's a real honor to be here and to talk alongside this wonderful panel. Many thanks to the organizers for inviting me, and to Jordan for all your work setting up this event during a pandemic. So meritocracy today means the idea of a social system in which the ladder of opportunity is there for us if only we work hard enough to activate our talent and climb up it. But is meritocracy possible? Is it now so very far out of reach, less plausible than ever, that even the dream itself has died? Are we post-meritocracy? If so, what's replacing it and what should replace it? I'm going to be discussing these questions by picking apart the bundle of meanings that we have come to wrap up in the word, and by analysing how it's been weaponised. Because, I argue, we cannot understand this powerful idea unless we grasp how it's been used and abused in relation to its wider social, political, and economic context. Over the past 40 years, under neoliberal politics in practice, the myth of meritocracy has become a key justification for rapidly increasing economic inequality. This continues to be the case even now in a climate where meritocracy is both being increasingly questioned and when the idea of fairness that it gestures towards is moving further and further out of reach. So the idea of meritocracy as being normal and fair has been popularised and embedded across a range of spheres. It's palpable in the language of politicians across much of the political spectrum, although they activate it in different registers, whether socially liberal like Obama or Trudeau, national authoritarian like Donald Trump or Boris Johnson, or with a religious inflection like Joe Biden, who recently tweeted that everyone should be given the opportunity to go as far as their dreams and God-given ability will take them. It also animates our media culture. Over the past few decades, globally franchised TV talent shows like Idol and The Apprentice have promoted a social landscape in which talent succeeds through continual fierce competition between us. And it's an idea to which, of course, higher education is central. For education is understood to supply many rungs of the ladder. Neoliberal meritocracy has normalized this idea of education involving atomized competition through, for example, the relentless expansion of league tables, a phenomenon which has been roundly satirized recently. So meritocracy has become a deeply normalized part of contemporary structures of feeling, and it is transnational, I think, to a large extent, even if it's very variegated and not uniform. I think we can understand meritocracy in two broad and interconnected ways. Firstly, as a social structure which has as its core tenets the ideas of social mobility and equality of opportunity. As such, it's legitimated by a very different conceptual structure from that of a social system based around redistribution and egalitarianism of equality of condition and outcome. And secondly, I think we can understand meritocracy as an ideology, a cultural discourse which has wide and deep historical and geographical lineages. The meanings it connects to are varied and contextually specific. What meritocracy looks like is very different in 17th century China to 19th century Britain or to contemporary Singapore. And this shape-shifting quality whereby it accrues to and affects to different characteristics is key, I think, to how it retains its power. And it's also proved to be very tenacious because it does undoubtedly contain vivid elements of fairness. So the idea of social mobility is itself pitted against older forms of unfairly inherited privilege. And it's surely right that everyone should have a chance to progress and develop themselves to work in fields they are capable of working in, regardless of their background. It's right that establishments shouldn't contract and ossify to keep the golden gates of power with the privileged inside. It's right that people should not be discriminated against. All these points, which are generally part of the package of meaning that is meritocracy, are, I think, irrefutable. But these grains of truth are used alongside a sackload of mystification, or to put it bluntly, of lies. It's been actively mobilized by a plutocracy to extend their own interests and power. Since the 1980s, it's become the cultural alibi for the power grabbers of contemporary neoliberal capitalism. So let's break this down. What is wrong with meritocracy? Here are 5 reasons. Firstly, it's structurally impossible. I think crucially, meritocracy as a word has only ever been used to describe a system involving vastly unequal economic rewards for different jobs. This is fundamental to its problem. Those who achieve pass on more privilege to their children, thus contributing to an unequal social starting block. So it's impossible, it's a tautology. Meritocracy conjures up the idea of the level playing field whilst not being one. Secondly, it endorses a competitive, individualistic ladder system of social mobility, in which by definition people must fail and be left behind. As Raymond Williams pointed out back in 1958, the ladder is a perfect symbol of the bourgeois ideal of society, for whilst it undoubtedly offers the opportunity to climb, it can only be used individually. You go up the ladder alone. As he says, it sweetens the poison of hierarchy by offering growth through merit rather than through money or birth, whilst retaining a commitment to the very notion of hierarchy itself. So such narratives promise opportunity whilst fostering social division. And these promises of meritocracy have become more loudly trumpeted, and competitive participation has become presented as a moral obligation, whilst this ladder has grown longer. The potential for upward social mobility has declined as the socialized protection of the public sector and its jobs are whittled away, either slowly or quickly, depending on where you live. Thirdly, meritocracy often assumes that talent or intelligence is a primarily inborn, essentialized ability that's either given the chance to succeed or not. But really, merit and talent are far more complex. You might, for example, have a talent for playing clarinet, but you're not going to know that unless you have access to it, unless you have access to tuition and time and space to practice. And furthermore, what talent and merit mean have been profoundly and problematically gendered and racialized. So as Lani Gunier discusses in terms of the history of Harvard admissions, for example, we can see how it's ebbed and flowed between policies of expansion and racist panic. In the early 20th century, to offset what leaders framed as the Jewish problem, they introduced photographs and the idea of a well-rounded character into the admissions process as a deliberate means of discrimination. And we can think about how certain groups of people having less merit has, of course, also been an argument used in apartheid. It was an argument used against the suffragettes, and it's an argument which features in the eugenicist rival of recent years. A fourth problem is that in the savagely hierarchical rankings of status that it endorses, certain professions are put at the top, but why and whether they should be there is less discussed. So why is a successful entrepreneur or an actor a role to aspire to and reward so much more than that of a nurse or a care home worker? As the pandemic and the forest fires show, we need to value our interdependence on our social and ecological infrastructures. But neoliberal meritocracy gives huge economic value to jobs which are socially useless, whilst rendering the jobs that sustain our lives, like care work and garbage collection, as abject. And the fifth key problem with meritocracy is that it functions as a myth to obscure the role meritocracy itself plays in actually expanding economic and social inequality. So the most unequal Western society, the US, doesn't have any more fluid intergenerational mobility than that of Sweden, the most equal Western society, but its myth of social mobility is used to validate greater inequality. Now, I think to understand why this is so, we need to think historically. The word meritocracy itself has a very short but incredibly convoluted history. The first recorded use is by the British industrial sociologist and socialist Alan Fox in 1956. And for him, it's a term of abuse. Why on earth should we give more economic prizes to the already prodigiously gifted, he says. Then it was popularised by Michael Young's social democratic critique in The Rise of the Meritocracy. And this book, this satirical book, presents a fictional dystopia with deeply hierarchical future where the smart govern and there's a massive trade in black market babies, brainy babies. So Young's book was itself a satire of the new divisions opening up in education in the 1950s in the UK through the introduction of selective grammar schools, which organised children's life chances at the age of 11. And in the late 1950s, Hannah Arendt also critiqued this divided education system by stating quite clearly that meritocracy contradicts the principle of equality. So it's very noticeable that the critique of education and of economic stratification are there from the start. And at this time, meritocracy is a term of slander. But in the 1970s, it was adopted by Young's close friend in the States, Daniel Bell, the sociologist, who reconfigured meritocracy as a positive idea, as an engine of the knowledge economy. And from there, it became used from the 1980s by a range of right-wing think tanks in the US and the UK as a justification to reduce socialised forms of provision and to privatise services. So in the UK, it was deliberately employed by think tanks to try and privatise comprehensive schooling, a strategy which has succeeded to a significant degree with the expansion of academies. So the word has done a U-turn in its common sense value, and it's been deliberately and energetically presented as normal since the 1980s, since the rise of the right. Now, what's specific about contemporary neoliberal meritocracy, I think, is that firstly, it extends the logic of competition into the nooks and crannies of our everyday life, including our emotional lives and our social media. And secondly, that it's drawn on the vitality of 1960s social movements. So from the 1980s, the idea that everyone, regardless of gender or ethnicity, should have an equal chance has been popularised as a neoliberal sales technique. And disempowered constituencies have been positioned as particularly amenable to a meritocratic discourse of empowerment through mediated parables of progress, such as the estate kid making it big, the boy who moved from ice cream sales to star in Dragon's Den. But they don't explain the social context of success or of failure. They don't explain how some of these entrepreneurs became incredibly successful because they made money, for example, off the back of privatized services or property, for example. Whilst at the same time, there's been an increase in the punitive blaming people for their failures. It's become even more pronounced as the economic distance between the 1% and everyone else gets longer and longer. So all these forms of social fetishization of individual success are profoundly unhealthy, and they don't address the large social obstacles faced by so many people. And they also act as a motor for the abuses in education, as we saw in the case of the school TM Landry in Louisiana, which boasted of channeling poor Black students to elite colleges, but was revealed to have falsified records and subjected children to physical abuse, as well as the bribery by the wealthy, including Hollywood actors, exhibited in the 2019 US college admission scandal, where cash was paid for access. So the onus is also on students to rise up through an unequal education system rather than to share the resources of that system around more equitably. And we can see very clearly how such pressure plays out in the case of Oxbridge and the Ivy League, where the best way to succeed works to serve the already ultra-privileged. And I think it's notable that hedge fund and private equity billionaires who are in effect driving the financial crisis and inequality have been the largest donors to these institutions, and it's a process which re-entrenches the idea that we should have an ever increasingly hierarchical system in which the wealthy are just given more and more. In the UK, you can also see this in how large universities have, over the past 20 years, developed different kinds of segregated accommodation systems, which have become profoundly classed. So you have blocks for the ultra rich, then you have more modest apartments for the middle class, and you have students staying at home if they can't afford either. I know that's not new in other parts of the world. So marketization has come to mean new forms of social segregation. And working class students have been instructed to aspire to escape their communities, meanwhile, rather than governments acting to make their communities better, whilst they rack up debts greatly exceeding their upper middle class counterparts whose parents can contribute far more to their education. This double class consciousness involves the painful process of being encouraged to position your own background as deficient. The journalist Shannon Proudfoot noted in Maclean's that her working class Canadian background feels like an invisible fact that shapes everything, but is acknowledged nowhere. She points to this sense of failure that it imbues on the left behind. As she says, put bluntly, if living the same life as your parents and everyone that you grew up around is somehow a failure, how are you supposed to feel about that? How are they supposed to feel about that? How are they supposed to feel about you when you come back home for a visit? Such sentiments are what Sam Friedman calls the price of the ticket, and as Michael Sandel has recently emphasised, it leads to feelings of grievance against elites. Today, as inequality soars, increasing numbers of people can see that the dream of meritocracy is further out of reach. This has been particularly pronounced since the 2008 crash, I think. More media narratives of the social obstacles people face to progress and to survive, you might think of the TV series Breaking Bad, as well as more academic books on the subject, including mine, have registered this. But we are not post-meritocracy, and it is important to specify how to disaggregate the politics. There is widespread disillusion with the meritocratic dream, but there is also a very live contest to scoop up the allegiance of those people who are disillusioned. And this contest is, I think, we might say, between three groups. Firstly, the socially liberal neoliberals. Meritocracy is still circulated as a socially liberal neoliberal narrative. This formation is anti-racist, anti-sexist, but is fine with huge economic disparities. This discourse has a great deal of currency, even though it is critiqued. And secondly, we have the more dangerous formation of an authoritarian neo-nationalist formation that uses the extreme myth of meritocracy to aid the rapid dismantling of democratic structures, what Wendy Brown calls de-democratization. You can see this in the way that Donald Trump deploys merit in racist appeals to whites whose income has been squeezed by presenting them with various social scapegoats to their imagined progression, whether these groups are BLM, Antifa, or university lecturers. So that's the second group. And then I think we have a third group who is interested, a group made up of people who are interested in people disillusioned with meritocracy, who don't believe in it, who don't believe in meritocracy, who think it is a sham, and who want to see genuine egalitarianism in terms of race, gender, and economics, more socialized forms and infrastructures of care. So those are the three groups, I think, who are competing for the disillusioned. Addressing the myth of meritocracy has to happen on a variety of fronts. To do so will involve pointing out that meritocracy, in both its neoliberal and authoritarian disaster capitalist variants, involves actively removing more and more rungs of the ladder. We need to show the sheer extent of the economic redistribution and the social theft that is already happening. The world's 2,000 billionaires now have more wealth than 4.6 billion people. At the same time, the idea that this meritocratic system somehow involves a level playing field is a fiction that serves the vested interests of an elite. And I think at the same time, though, it is also a very powerful idea with a lot of traction that can be used as a resource. Because if we really want the reality of an equal playing field, we have to popularize the ideas of redistributing wealth, ending privatization in favor of collective provision, creating social infrastructures of care, taxing the rich and introducing a maximum as well as a minimum wage, whilst prioritizing environmental care so we can make sure we even have a living field in the first place. A level playing field involves robust anti-discrimination policies, and it involves fair use of quotas, and Canada is leading the way in terms of gender in the cabinet here. In terms of education, it means that we need to end the corrosive culture of vast student debt, to stop producing education to league tables and competitive metrics, which force universities and staff to compete rather than collaborate, to reverse the trend of an exploited army of lecturers on temporary contracts, and to stop overworking and infantilizing lectures with audit culture. So all of this means stopping the processes of marketizing and privatization, reversing those processes, bringing accommodation and services back in-house through insourcing. It also involves raising awareness of the histories of cooperative education and their use in the present, and linking with activity across the wider sector to end the corporate destruction of education, providing education that's free at the point of use and sharing the wealth. Saying no to the myth of meritocracy and making meritocracy satire again is key to that process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe, for an amazing lecture. I've learned a lot from that, and I'll have lots of questions, and I'm sure so we'll have a panel and a discussion later. So we'll now turn to the panel portion of the event, which will be moderated by Trish Hennessy. Let me give a brief introduction to Trish Hennessy. Trish is a senior communication strategist at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and the director of Think Upstream. She was the founding director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, CCP Ontario office, which focused on income inequality, decent work, and the role of government from a provincial and municipal perspective. And she also co-founded and directed the CCP's national project examining income inequality in Canada. She also co-founded the Ontario Living Wage Network. So Trish, thanks a lot for doing all this for us, and I welcome Trish Hennessy now. Thanks.
Thank you, Raul, and thank you, Joe, for that excellent keynote. You've really set the table for this conversation about meritocracy beautifully, so thank you. And thanks for writing this excellent book. For those of you who are tuning in, if you don't have a copy of Joe's book, Against Meritocracy, I highly recommend it. It's an excellent read. Now we're going to turn to our group of expert Canadian panelists who will talk about meritocracy in the Canadian context. So I'm going to introduce Rupa Banerjee, who is an associate professor in the Department of Human Resource Management and Organizational Behavior at the Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson University. Carl James teaches in the Faculty of Education at York University, where he holds the Jean Augustine Chair in Education, Community and diaspora, and currently serves as the university's Affirmative Action, Equity, and Inclusivity Officer. Wayne Luchuk is a founding member of the School of Labor Studies at McMaster University. He is a professor emeritus in the School of Labor Studies and Department of Economics. So we're going to start with Rupa and then over to Carl and then Wayne, and then we're going to have a question and answer session. So for those of you who are joining us today, please feel free to start typing questions for Joe and for the panelists in that chat feature. We'll be monitoring that and we'll bring your questions in after our excellent panelists give their presentation. So Rupa, over to you.
Thanks, Trish. So I'm going to be speaking about the relationship between meritocracy and the Canadian immigration system. So the myth of meritocracy really affects the Canadian immigration system at two critical points. First, during the immigrant selection process, and second, after immigrants arrive in Canada. So in terms of immigrant selection, Canada has, of course, for the past 50 years or so, instituted a point system which claims to assess and assign merit-based points for formal education, work experience, language ability, and other endowments. The commonly held narrative around the evolution of the immigration system is that the creation of the point system moved Canada past the earlier, uglier period of racist admission policies to a much more equitable and fair process, which removed the unjustified barriers to entry. Canadian politicians are extremely proud of the point system and often describe immigration as a global war for talent, in which Canada is competing against other countries to attract the best and brightest from around the world. Now, there's a number of problems with this conceptualization. First, it assumes that the criteria within the point system is valid and fair. But we know that the point system doesn't exist in a vacuum. It has differential impacts based on gender, country of origin, and social class. So just as an example, recent changes to the structure of the points system gives applicants who completed a post-secondary credential in Canada before immigration extra points. So in conjunction with that, post-secondary institutions have prioritized the recruitment of international students, often in partnership with private organizations with extremely high tuition fees, of course. So essentially, this provides a pathway for wealthy individuals to enter Canada through the point system based on financial means, not necessarily their effort or raw talent. The narrative of a merit-based immigration system also obscures the actual picture of migration in Canada today. In 2017, only about 49% of entrants were permanent immigrants. The other half were temporary residents. And these temporary residents entered through a myriad of complicated programs, which are not based on any point system. While increasingly many high-skilled workers are entering through these streams, the actual criteria through which they're evaluated and admitted is opaque. But we have to remember that many temporary foreign workers are still arriving to do low-status, low-paid jobs in agriculture, caregiving, food services, and construction. We rely on these workers, and the pandemic has really shined a light on the essential work of, for example, seasonal agricultural workers, and just how vulnerable these workers are. The rhetoric of the merit-based immigration policy really hides a two-tier system of immigration which stratifies core rights and privileges based on human capital. The researcher Antje Ellerman out of UBC has called this system human capital citizenship. Those immigrants who are deemed to be high-skilled are viewed as worthy, good, and deserving of residency rights, family unification, and at least a measure of labor rights, while those who are admitted under temporary worker streams are denied these very basic rights because of their perceived lack of skill. The immigration narrative that Canada has created largely renders these workers invisible and overlooks the economic contributions of low-status foreign workers and often traps them in a position of being permanently temporary. Now, even those high-skilled permanent immigrants who make it through the point system face significant hardship once they actually enter the Canadian labor market. The admission criteria within the point system doesn't match up with the expectations of employers. So immigrants often find that their qualifications are severely devalued in Canada. Most studies of immigrant employment integration are grounded in human capital theory, which views individual talent, effort, and open market competition as the key determinants of immigrant integration rather than any structural constraints. But studies in this area have found that a sizable immigrant disadvantage remains unexplained even after human capital factors are accounted for, particularly for non-white, non-European immigrants. I recently completed a study in which I interviewed hiring managers in a variety of different industries. I asked them about their strategies and experiences with hiring skilled immigrants. I found that although all employers claim to value diversity, equity, and inclusion, the principle of meritocracy was viewed as being the most important value. Immigrants were not seen as a group that warranted any special accommodations. Instead, hiring managers expressed a strong preference for Canadian workplace behaviors and used descriptors like Canadian experience, non-transferable skills, and cultural fit as euphemism for facilitating exclusionary hiring practices. The most striking finding was that employers saw absolutely no conflict between their demand for Canadianness and their stance as inclusive employers. Essentially, employers used the idea of meritocracy to justify blatantly discriminatory organizational practices. The discourse of meritocracy sorts immigrants into categories of desirable and undesirable, and blocks pathways to permanent residence and basic human rights for productive but lower status temporary foreign workers. Finally, under the shield of meritocracy, Canadian employers can rationalize their ethnocentric views and place the responsibility of integration squarely on the shoulders of immigrants themselves. Thanks so much.
Thank you. The myth of meritocracy is something I want to talk about, and I want to think about it as, for whom is it a myth? Who has the privilege of thinking of it as not a myth? I consider how much meritocracy, democracy, opportunities, fairness work out for individuals and how it depends on who they are, thinking about gender, race, ethnicity, etc., etc. Of course, I'm thinking about it at this time when COVID-19 and talk of systemic racism are exacerbating the problems of inequity in a society which prefers to be silent on race or not to see race. I want us to consider how meritocracy operates with regard to higher education, to gaining access to higher education. Who gets access and how do they get access to higher education? And the role of access to education, what role does that play in individuals' eventual outcome? How students get to college and university starts at the very early in kindergarten. As Domino Penner writes in an article, Categorical Inequality, school structure and legitimate social inequality in societies. One way is by issuing a status of differentiated set of educational credentials that interact with the labor market and other social systems to influence individuals' placement in contemporary system and social stratification. Littler, our keynote, explained how meritocracy operates within our neoliberal context and as a myth. Especially, it focuses overwhelmingly on individual efforts and in many ways how it's all about individuals and how they operate, the efforts they put in, how they work hard or not work hard. Schools and education are central to that meritocratic process and informing how students and how individuals might take advantage of opportunities that's presented to them, and also presented as if it's a level playing field and therefore it's the individual effort. When we think of early schooling and going into kindergarten, students are very early given and socialized into the idea of the value of grades and how grades are going to inform and influence promotion. And throughout that schooling process, individuals are given role models, and particular kinds of individuals are presented as role models, as people who have made it in the society and reinforce the idea that hard work and opportunities exist, again, only if you work very hard. And beyond that, then, after those early years in kindergarten, students are further encouraged to think about high school. And of course, it's in grade 9 in the Canadian context that students are further sorted into particular kinds of areas, into what we think of their potential and their abilities that will enable them to eventually get where we would want to see them in society. So they might be tracked or streamed into academic or basic, or another area would be where they would go to directly to work, or they might be streamed into university. And it is during those high school years again, they're sorting and reproducing and representing them as the possibilities for them by providing role models, by providing them people who have worked hard, and also the notion of the exception. So the exception becomes the person who will return to schools and show, yes, you have made it out of these communities. And in many cases, I'm thinking of how some of these opportunities are related to the communities that students live in and the opportunities there in terms of the schooling. So they're sorted in those schools, and eventually they get to university. Now, this sort concerns, and when in university, what's interesting about how it's structured, sometimes university students become the role models who return to high school to show how you can make it as well. I did it. And therefore, if only you apply yourself and prove yourself, you'll be able to make it in society. I want to think seriously here about how race operates, especially in the case of Black students whom I work with. The idea is for them is not just to work hard, but also to work harder, because you are competing not against not against your peer on the same level, but you're competing against whiteness and what whiteness has done for making the situation very, very difficult for you. They're also competing to prove themselves, to show that they might not fit the stereotype. And therefore, if they fit the stereotype, like in the case of many of the youth I work with, it's the possibility of they're not good for university. University program might not be what will be worked for them, because that is what the guidance counselors told them. Or becoming an athlete might be another. And so they will operate against that, because that's how they're constructed. Again, they're operating in this way in a society where we fail to think of race as a factor informing the situations in which students find themselves, and also race as a factor informing the opportunities that students have and where they're able to live and where they go to school and how that operates. In all this, these young people, especially the Black youth with whom I work, might think of only if I work harder, only if I get the right grades, only if my teachers they help me and care for me in order to get where I want to go. And they will be presented with quote unquote role models, or they will be presented with what might be seen as opportunities. And it reinscribes how it's your effort that will enable you to get there. And so they live with hope, or they live with an optimism that some scholars call the cruelty of that optimism, because at no time in that process sometimes do the teachers or do the society reinforce the fact that it's the institutional policies, programs, it's the way in which society is operated that might be informing and letting it possible for you to get where you want to go. And that for me is important to think of. Is meritocracy a myth? Is it, as some authors call it, is it a cruel way in which we maintain and support the society and maintain young people's opportunities? Is it a trap, as some scholars would put it, that we recognize, but at the same time, and think of it, it maintains the system in which we live and where we want to go? That's important for us to think about. And again, for me, we have to think about it, how race and racism, especially in this time of COVID, might be operating to make those opportunities or to exacerbate the inequities in our society so that some students, racialized students, indigenous students, and Black students in particular, might not be able to make it and be able to realize their potential in society that tells them that, yes, by merit, you're going to get there. But all the things work that they put in might not work. Thank you. Thank you.
Wayne, you're on mute.
I'd like to start by thanking Okufa for letting me be part of this important and interesting conversation. For the last 10 years, I've been working with a group of scholars, including a number from United Way of Toronto, looking at how the changing nature of our labor market is affecting individuals, households, and communities. We've been looking at a number of issues related to meritocracy. In 2018, we released a report under the PEPSO banner, pepso.ca, all our stuff is available there, called Getting Left Behind. And it's really a test of how economic growth affects insecurity. And it asks a simple question: can strong economic growth lead to a more equitable and fair society? We compared some data that we had in the Toronto-Hamilton area from 2011 with data from 2017. And we looked at who won and who didn't during a period of really very strong economic growth. Unemployment was down significantly. The number of jobs available was up significantly in that period. And we asked the question, did it affect, who are the winners and who are the losers? We looked at the impact of gender, the impact of race, and the impact of education. And the conclusion from that was that economic growth is not necessarily a solution to economic inequality. In fact, what we found is that during a period of very strong economic growth, the gap between the winners and the losers actually broadened. It was better to be a male than a female. It was better to be white than racialized. And it was better to have a university degree than not have a university degree. But how those things interacted was very different for different groups of workers. So that what we found is that in 2011, it was best to be a white male with a university degree. And those who did the poorest in the labor market were racialized women without a degree. In 2017, that hierarchy continued, but what we found is actually the gap between the advantage that white men with a university degree had compared to racialized women without a degree actually widened. And during that period, certain groups did not actually fall behind. So for instance, during that period, racialized women with a degree actually were worse off in 2017 than in 2011. And workers without a university degree generally made absolutely no gains during that period. So the first message there is economic growth on its own is not going to raise all boats. The problem is if your boat is sitting on a sandbank and the tide begins to rise, if your boat has holes in it, well, you drown. And I think that's an issue that we need to address in terms of policy issues. I think Joe Littler's discussion addressed some of those concerns. The second study that we've recently published in 2020 looked at the experience in Hamilton during Ontario's very brief basic income experiment. We looked at how giving people a basic income affects their economic outcomes. And the results here are really quite startling. They suggest that giving people at the bottom of the economic pile a bit of a leg up can have a tremendous impact on their success as individuals in our society. What we found is that the vast majority of those people, they continued to work after receiving a basic income. They didn't stop receiving a basic income, but many of them actually moved to jobs that were more secure, that had better long-term prospects, that actually paid more. And some people, not very many, chose an alternative path to contributing to our society, caring for sick family members, engaging more in community activity, all of which are important in terms of how we move forward in society. So I think the message there is we all face barriers in realizing our goals and aspirations, but some people face more barriers than others, and in particular, racialized workers, workers without degrees, women face more barriers than white men with degrees. And what we need are policy initiatives that give people more opportunities if we hope to have a more equal society. But simply stimulating the economy is not the solution to these challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wayne and Carl and Rupa. We're going to bring all of the panelists and Joe back up. So if you could all put your videos on, come live for us. Thank you. Hi, good to see you all. Great work setting the table there. I'm going to start Q&A. And so Joe, let's start with you and your powerful critique of meritocracy, how meritocracy is an illusion, an ideological myth. And you know, for some people, saying that you're against meritocracy might feel counterintuitive because we have been taught, as you've all said, to promote social mobility based on merit, that, you know, work hard, play by the rules, and you'll get ahead. And a lot of people measure their own success against that of their parents and grandparents and say, yeah, I worked hard, I got ahead, and have internalized that promise. And yet at the same time, we know that in the UK, in the USA, and even here in Canada, income inequality is as bad as it was, you know, in the early 1920s. At the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, my colleagues just released analysis yesterday that showed during the course of this pandemic, Canada's richest 20 billionaires have actually been making a lot of money in the middle of the pandemic, while a lot of people are falling behind. And so, Joe, I have a couple of questions for you here. One, how does the myth of meritocracy still have hold in the general public when, you know, we've known for decades that income inequality just keeps getting worse and worse, and more people are getting left behind? And secondly, do you think that the advent of COVID-19, all of us living in a global pandemic that is exposing and exacerbating existing inequities, do you think that will dislodge it? So I'm going to ask that question to you, Joe, but panelists, after Joe weighs in, if you could weigh in terms of what you think changes because of COVID-19, that would be excellent. Thank you.
Okay, so good questions. So why does the myth of meritocracy still have purchase is your first one, yeah. Well, I think it partly because it, like I said at the beginning, it contains nuggets of truth alongside the sackload of mystification. And they're powerful, you know, so everyone wants to think that they can progress, and we can progress. Just what is meant by progression is the issue. And so I think that it's important to disaggregate what's at stake in meritocracy, and there's elements of it that are very useful, and it's important to recognize that, you know, hard work by itself isn't bad. The idea to move and flourish socially is not a bad idea. What's bad is how it becomes channeled into hyper-individualistic, hyper-competitive dreams that leave people behind and entrench inequality. So I think that it's the work of that kind of disaggregation is important and ongoing. It's just not something that happens overnight. It happens in a range of spaces and places, and we can't be complacent and think just because, you know, inequality is increasing and because it's more palpable, with this ideological scaffolding that's taken decades to build up will just disappear. Which brings me, I guess, to your next question about COVID and what the effects of a pandemic on the idea of meritocracy are. I think they do several things. They make a very important dent in the idea of meritocracy, because to start with, people don't really think so much about individual progression at this time. People are more concerned about looking after each other, about whether they and the people around them that they know are going to survive and get through it. So there's a kind of an obvious way in which we become more attuned to the social infrastructures around us, to the caring infrastructures, and the spotlight is beamed on that in a way that it hasn't been for a long time, which is an opportunity, isn't it, for us to revalue or reset, in some of the political parlance, what our social priorities are. But at the same time, again, it is being used to entrench further inequality. So we might think, for example, how in Britain we're encouraged to clap for carers, but we're not encouraged to give them proper protection or a pay rise. So the right-wing government is kind of actively using that sense of community solidarity, but not developing it. In fact, developing the opposite.
Yeah, very performative.
Yeah, exactly. And similarly, you can think of how there's a range of companies that do what my co-author on the Care Manifesto, Andreas Chatzidakis, calls care washing. So desperately trying to promote through PR, showing that they care, even though they're not really dealing with the problems in their supply chains.
Yeah, COVID-19, the pandemic really exposes that, doesn't it? Carl, Rupa, Wayne, does COVID-19 change things here in terms of dislodging that myth of meritocracy in Canada?
I guess maybe I'll go very quickly. I feel that, obviously there's been some media attention on issues of temporary foreign workers and the vulnerabilities that they face. But that's happened before at certain junctions. And I feel that oftentimes people then move on and it doesn't stick. And so although the public awareness is certainly on it right now, so there are a lot of efforts to try and leverage that sentiment, but I'm concerned that I don't know if that would really have a lasting impact on the way that temporary foreign workers, lower status temporary foreign workers, are really viewed at all. Yes.
I think COVID has exposed the inequities much more. And I think George Floyd also influenced the idea of the place of race in this discussion. The problem with George Floyd is that it's not just the police. We have to also think how that same issues that we're talking about, how the inequitable ways in which police deal with Black people in the US and in Canada, we have to think about how that's operating in the education system and all other systems that we can think about, because all these are all intersected. And the Black person is not just seen by the police, and the police do not only see that person in particular ways. Those are traits and ideas that the entire society nurtures, and therefore we have to see how that's translated in the education system. So, and for us in Canada here is when we think of COVID, yeah, we think of class, but we have to constantly think of it in relation to race as well. And we just can't simply use racialized people. We have to also disaggregate race, because Blacks, Indigenous people, South Asian, they're going to have different experiences in the society in terms of education, in terms of economics, in terms of the people most likely, and some of the research shows that one of the group, the racialized group that most likely to have the problems related to COVID and die of COVID are Blacks. And it's Britain, in the US, and in Canada. And therefore we have, and again, that's not only because of some biological fact, but also because of the economic situation they have, because of the not being able to have the access and opportunities because of where they live, et cetera, et cetera. So while COVID has exposed all this, the problem is, or the question to be asked then is, how are we going to go about it, especially in Canadian society, where race and racism is so endemic and really not addressed fully?
Tricia, if I could just add, I think Carl is absolutely right that what COVID has done is it has exposed how many people are how their existence is actually quite fragile, given how we've organized our economy and our society. And I think it has created opportunities that, to be frank, were not there 12 months ago. So for instance, I think the right-wing critique of budget deficits has been remarkably muted. I mean, given the size of the deficits, we'll see what it looks like 12 months from now. But at the present moment, that vision of society has in some ways been undermined, and a new one is replacing it, one where the state has a greater role in ensuring everyone succeeds. And I think that's hugely helpful and optimistic. But again, we'll see what things look like in 12 months.
Yeah, 12 months or even, 2-3 years from now, especially if we go into a protracted economic recession or depression, even where the inequities in the system get further and further exposed. Let's talk about the university system. That's where they lure us. Go get an education, and you need a higher education just to even get into the labor market. And it's your responsibility to figure out how you can do that, especially if you come from a background where, maybe you don't have a family that can afford to put you through university. So then you take on, a debt the size of a mortgage payment or a mortgage, a mortgage and down payment, I mean to say. And higher education is a part of perpetuating that myth and that promise. And so how do you address that within the university system? Feel free to jump in. Don't be polite.
I think when it comes to the university system, we can say, yes, everyone is entitled to education going through early years, high school and that, but it's the grades you get, whether you can afford to get to university, and sometimes your access to scholarships and who gets access to scholarships, all those kind of things, going to end up influencing whether you get to university. So it pushes the whole notion of competition, which is so much a part of the neoliberal agenda and so much a part of how we might think of what's going on. But I keep saying, how do we talk about the curriculum or the resource materials that students are getting? Do we tell professors that you need to incorporate and think of the diversity of your classroom that you're working with, and therefore bring them in? How do we talk about who are the professors when we think of do we have affirmative action program as in the US in the Canadian context, or are we just simply thinking that yes, you're going to get there on merit? And here's another way in which merit operates. We're going to get the best person. It's the best person who's going to be able to get the job in the university to teach the courses, etc., etc. At the same time, we never get back to looking at how do we define best, and how do we assess those credentials, and when were those credentials assessed? Do they have relevance today? All those are very important questions, and I'm not sure that COVID and all these things are going to get us thinking and re-looking at those things. It cannot be just simply the individual. We have to look at the institutions and the policies and programs and practices that have perpetuated and brought about the kinds of inequities that we have today.
Trish, if I could, I think we'd be foolhardy to ignore that it's much better in this system to have a degree, university degree, than to not have one. For the most part, some of us can be Bill Gates, most of us cannot, and make billions without a university degree. But for most of us, you do need that credential. And so I think what's really important is to broaden access, and access is truly problematic. And when we run a system where only those with the highest grades can get in, I think it's a false narrative, because my experience, I teach in a labor studies program. Often we attract students who didn't have the highest grades. That's why they didn't go into engineering or business. And to be very honest with you, the students that come in with the B and B plus averages will often leave the university with A and A plus abilities, because they're given an opportunity to learn. So I think access is quite important, but I also think what goes on within the university is really quite critical. And I think some of the messages that are taught in various university settings are really counterproductive towards a more equal society. They bolster the existing system. They encourage this competition, and to be frank, it can be very anti-working class, anti-people who haven't succeeded, and somehow self-justifying that if you're at university, well, you must be better. And I think that itself, I think, is a bit of a false narrative. We all have a range of skills, and we all apply them differently. But the university, I think, really does encourage this idea that some of us are better than others. And I think that's a narrative that should be challenged.
Yes, I agree. And it's interesting, like, looking at the different systems in different countries as well, because in the UK, Wayne, what you were saying made me think about how adult education and for mature students and part-time learning has really been decimated in the UK. And it was such an important part of the university experience for so many people, and it was really key to widening access. So I'd like to see, universities being able to take that job on once more and to integrate themselves in the community, as well as thinking about how they're, global leaders on a world stage. How do they connect to the physical community around them? And in the UK as well, there's quite a push at the moment to provide a two-tiered segregated university system. So the idea that we need to have more vocational training, that we need to kind of reimagine the division between universities and polytechnics. It's kind of gathering ground. So I'd like to see more pushback on that, and think about the question of, what kind of universities do we want, and how do they relate to the societies that we want?
I guess what I would want to add to this is, from the perspective of newcomers, of immigrants, often many of whom arrive through this extremely merit-based point system, they themselves are extremely indoctrinated into believing that they are meritorious for getting here. They made it. They made it through the point system. And yet when they arrive, they often very commonly find that access to further education is extremely difficult for them, for a variety of reasons: financial reasons, time reasons, and also in terms of, if they do somehow manage to make it into a university, actually making it through the program, there's a lot of different barriers that they face on that front. Then those who actually make it through that system find that often is not even something that kind of eliminates all the barriers for them, because although it helps, although it's better than having a foreign credential, it doesn't take care of all the labor market devaluation that newcomers face. So there's so many layers of these barriers that newcomers face, and especially those who come through the point system. It's quite a shock, because they themselves very strongly believe in sort of meritocracy, and the fact that they are entitled to be here because of their skills. So
I would add to that is, how does university also credit their credentials once they come here? Is it seen as just as every credential, or do we just say, no, you have to do upgrading and things like that in order to get? So, but in thinking about university, we just can't isolate university. We have to think of the pipeline to university. It's always, they're so intermeshed that to who gets to university is so dependent on what happened in grade one, and what's happening in grade one and who gets to university is what is going to depend on the images that we give on in our media about the possibilities of who is going to have the credentials to talk to particular issues. So it's all in these integrated stuff.
And including just the postal code that you're born into, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because we're seeing how that postal code is operating on who gets to university, but more, also how it's, and Joe also talked earlier about who are the carers, you know, especially during COVID times. We remember the doctors and the nurses, et cetera, but what about those people who are the workers who live in marginalized communities, who are the caretakers in many cases, who are also doing some of the real work, the work that allows those other caretakers, the credentialed ones, to be able to carry out the job. We forget them as caretakers.
Absolutely, and allowed many people to shelter down, you know, that quarantine privilege. Yes, excellent points, thank you. Let's go to some, we've got like lively audience participation here, so let's go to some audience questions. Joe, I think this first one is for you. The question is, can you elaborate on the term audit culture? What does that look like in the UK? And are there lessons to be learned and heeded in Canada from what has occurred in the UK? How do we fight it, especially when so many colleagues seem to buy into it? So Joe, if you could answer that, but any of the panelists after Joe, if you want to bring in the Canadian context and how you would answer that question, I would just welcome you to join in.
Okay, well, audit culture in universities mainly refers to the increasing battery of processes that academics are subjected to, and students as well, in terms of having to fill in feedback forms, being treated as consumers in focus groups, and they constantly get feedback fatigue at the end of courses, having to fill in so many forms. But in a way, you might think of how there's the research excellence framework and the teaching excellence framework, which have been introduced as means to kind of share around the resources of the university sector more equitably. That's their main purpose, but at the same time, they're part of a neoliberal logic in which vast amounts of resources have been poured into them, and huge amounts of time is spent on putting together packages which audit people's research value according to a hierarchical logic, and in which people are graded on their teaching. So in effect, it means that the labor of packaging up what you do and showing what you do for someone else takes more time than doing the act itself. So instead of having the time to do research, people have to package up how they've impacted, that research has produced impact, for example. So I think audit is an important and useful mechanism by itself, but the questions to ask are, does this audit process infantilize us? Does it take time away from the core task that we are doing, the core task of teaching and research? And is there a more equitable alternative, and how might that be produced?
Trish, if I could just add to that, I think the examinations are a central part of a university. And I think that university administrators, they simply cannot conceptualize an educational process without constant testing. We run a labor outreach program with one of the big unions here in Canada, and we don't test people. We don't evaluate them on an ongoing basis. And I can tell you the administration, they do look at me like I'm some kind of a lunatic. No, they may be right. I mean, that's a real possibility. But my experience is you just don't need constant testing evaluation to have positive educational outcomes. So I think dialing back the constant evaluation that we do here would be beneficial for the mental health of the students, for their educational abilities, and I think for the educational project.
I like the idea of raising questions around testing. And again, how testing, of course, very early children come into grade 1, grade 2, all along, we're testing. And then we introduce standardized testing, or these, in the Canadian context, EQAO tests. And therefore, we see testing, sometimes we see testing as objective, et cetera, But this testing becomes part of that process of, again, it's about how well you do, hard work, et cetera. So it reinscribes the competition, and it reinscribes the idea that meritocracy is on your merit, you're going to pass the test. Never mind the social conditions that happen, that you live in, or you're able to. Never mind the fact, especially now when we're thinking about students having access to computers and all these other kinds. They're going to be tested, obviously, eventually, and we're going to have the same reinscribed or reinforced inequities that's going forward. And universities play a very, very significant role in this.
Well, I think this next audience question dovetails into this part of the conversation. As professors, we engage in merit by our tenure and promotion processes, and this ensures that meritocratic perspective is modeled and reinforced by our students and our communities. Are there ways for professors to interrupt this and move beyond? Who wants to jump in? Rupa?
I mean, I think there are ways. I don't know if they will be, something that universities would actually enact. Certainly thinking about the work of an academic in a more collective way would be a start, rather than this conceptualization of the lone wolf academic who's expected to produce research in a particular kind of way. So, for example, I know in a lot of tenure committees, how many lone authored publications you have is actually taken to signify, how high your quality is. So even the way that we think about our work as academics as being a very lonely and individual endeavor, perhaps needs to be interrogated and needs to be questioned. Sitting on several tenure committees myself, I know that the attitude towards what the quality of publications should be is very problematic. This idea that there are certain journals, certain outlets, which are, the only high quality way to actually get research out there, is another really big area of concern. And they're very prescriptive and arbitrary in many ways as well. And, also have very systemic consequences on certain kinds of researchers. So, for example, in my field, qualitative versus quantitative researchers, or, which also is related to other things like gender, family status, and other factors. So all of these are interrelated. And I think that right now, the culture of merit in the university system, the culture of tenure and promotion, breeds a kind of toxic individuality, which is really problematic.
At the same time, I would think that there is, in social science, yes, the lone writer sometimes, but in sciences, of course, there's a difference. But if we think that an article written, even in social science, written by a number of scholars, will bring a rich combination of ideas, different experiences, and interpretation, wouldn't that be much, much better than simply the lone author putting out that ideas? So it's important so how do we move from, culturally move from this whole idea of the single authored paper to think about how we can credit the fact that many, without having to say how much did you put in and how much this other person, especially when you're going up for tenure, somebody else is writing to say, yes, I wrote this article with this person. And but I also think about the journal as well, in that whole, which is the impact factor, the ways in which we think of some journals are much more impactful. Just as we think of some universities are the universities to get into compared to others. So this is a whole structural thing. So it's not going to be just the universities doing this. It's going to be a whole society, because parents are going to decide to send their children to particular kinds of university because of the impact factor of the journals that people publish it, probably. But the point to be made then is it's going to take all of us.
If I could, I mean, I think Carl's right. I think part of the problem with how we evaluate academic achievement is that it's really a disciplinary process. It somehow assumes that if there isn't some kind of a gatekeeper, we'll all skive off and put our feet up and do nothing. And I think that what that really fails to understand is why most of us became academics in the first place. And we became academics because we want to contribute, we want to understand, and we want to do our work well. And I don't think the merit system really contributes to that at all. If anything, it holds it back. And so I think a sense by university administrators a little more trustful that actually the faculty will do their job properly without being watched over would be beneficial. And I'm fearful that we're moving in the wrong direction. Places like Australia, the disciplinary process there on faculty is actually oppressive. I mean, it makes Canada look like a utopia, even though it isn't. And the point system, and I'm pretty soon they'll be introducing punch clocks at universities in Australia to make sure people are doing their job properly. So I think trusting faculty would be a start, and then we could do away with some of the police state that often is imposed upon us by our administrators.
I completely agree with all those points. I love them. Yeah, and just to add to them, I think there are so many different ways in which we can deal with the pressure on us to be wholly individualistic academics. We could think, for example, about how if the PhD process, it starts very early, doesn't it? The idea that you are on your own throughout this lonely process of acquiring knowledge. And I would like to see more community built into that from the start, a little bit more emphasis on people working together at that time. And we can think in terms of the merit system in which academics have come to mirror the inequality of wider society, just like universities do. I think we do need to have pay caps on academics at the top end to stop this kind of ridiculous star system getting out of control. And also it's nice, isn't it, to think of different ways here and there in which we can try to be less individualistic and work with other people. So yeah, I've found it, some of the best moments I've had in being an academic, they've all been about working with other people, whether it's students or other academics. So that's important to emphasize.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to ask a question which might actually take the rest of the time. I hope each one of you wants to weigh in on it. The question is, if we don't have meritocracy, will we not just return to nepotism and patronage and other inefficient recruitment policies in the public service or the academy? Who would like to start?
I can.
I was worried this one silenced the whole panel.
No. Well, it could go either way, couldn't it? At the moment, that is what Trump wants, really. There's nepotism in action right there in front of our eyes. So I think that that kind of politics draws a line between trying to scoop up those disillusioned with meritocracy and also tries to activate some of its narratives. So yes, the alternative to meritocracy can be extremely right-wing. It can also be extremely egalitarian. It can be a non-authoritarian form in which there's socialized provision, in which people do have a more level playing field and more of a chance to develop their talents. And I think that's what we need, both in terms of making sure we have more socialized forms of provision, making sure those forms of provision aren't authoritarian, and making sure that they are subject to, anti-discrimination, that we do have some measures of audit and bureaucracy in place to ensure that.
I mean, I think this is a serious question, but I think at the same time, I think we need to appreciate that different jobs require different capabilities, and different people bring different skills. And I think what we need is a system that can sort of match the needs of the job with the needs of the people. I think the problem we have right now is that our merit system is a false way of matching those two things, so that we don't necessarily promote people with skills, and we don't necessarily get the people with the right skills in the right jobs. And so I think what really is required is a broadening of how we're measuring capability. And one of the examples I can relate to is in our own hiring process. I think 20 years ago, it was quite common to take a candidate out to dinner, to chat about them, to see what their sports interests were, which team they supported. And these are all sorting mechanisms by which we got to think someone is, oh, that's a nice person, I'd like to work with that person. Let's hire that person, and sort of ignoring the fact that perhaps that wasn't the right person with the right skills and the right needs. So I think, we need to be sensitive to how we are measuring people, but I don't think we're going to stop measuring, because this isn't a case of throw a bunch of cards up in the air and where it lands. I think we need some sort of a sorting system, but our current sort of system is a false narrative. I think that's the problem.
Very briefly, I guess I agree with all of those points. What I would add is we need to think about skill and education as a public collective good, and consider the ways in which, serving the community, serving society, and basically working together as an interconnected organism is crucial to society. And until we have that mindset, I think that there is a danger to basically saying, well, if meritocracy doesn't work, then we're just going to go back to the old, uglier version. But it doesn't have to be that way, right? We could think of a more optimistic future, yes.
We have to think about how class, race, gender, sexuality, indigeneity operates in our society and feed all those things that's happening, or else the sorting is going to constantly be there unless we also recognize how we are complicit in perpetuating those sorting.
Thank you all. And especially if this is last question, you were also concise and spot on and focused. Thanks for this. You've been an amazing panel. Joe, thanks for, virtually joining us in Canada for this, and for sparking this important discussion. And Carl, Rupa, and Wayne, thank you for being rounding out this discussion in such excellent ways. Raul, I'm going to hand the baton over to you.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me loud and clear, because I've been having problem with Wi-Fi all day. Okay, so thank you so much. That was excellent. I really enjoyed the talk a lot, learned a lot. Thank you for all the questions. And my big thanks to Professor Joe Littler for joining us, as Tricia said, all the way from England. And I'm so, thank you for raising all the complex issues about neoliberal meritocracy, and also for explaining to us how it is deeply racialized and connecting it to the university sector, which is so crucial for all of us here at Akufa, and across the world, obviously. And I would also like to thank all the panelists here, Rupa, for making the very important point about international students and how it's also based on merit and it's all about money. And Carl, thanks a lot for raising a very, very important point about how our students, especially the Black students and the Indigenous students, are suffering even more because of COVID-19 and this whole system of merit-based. Wayne, thank you so much for explaining to us how economic growth can lead to more economic problems, actually, that economic growth can lead to economic inequalities. So this has been an excellent discussion. I wish we had more time, we could have carried on. And Trish, for doing an excellent job for us, because it's a very complex discussion to have. And so anyway, hopefully we'll have you back soon in the real world. And we'll meet you soon, despite COVID and despite the merit-based system, we'll make you fly in. Thank you. So a big thanks to all of you. And I would like to thank our sponsors here. So the event would not have been possible without our organizing partners and sponsors, which are OEZ at University of Toronto, University World News, Academia Group, Academic Matters Magazine, Goldblight Partners, and obviously ACUFA, and thanks to OISI Professor and Dean Glenn Jones, OISI postdoctoral fellow Grace Karam Stephenson, ACUFA staff Jordan Perolade, Garrett Tenbrick, Ben Lewis, Charlotte Rich, and Mark Rosenfeld, the interim executive director, who's been helping us a lot. So all of whom, thank you so much for making the event very successful. I would also like to thank a very important thanks to Michael Conlan, ACUFA's previous director, who played a key role in organizing this event. And a video of today's event will be available on the Worldviews website in the coming weeks for you to share with your friends and colleagues. An edited audio recording is also planned for the CBC Radio 1 program Ideas to make sure that the discussion just doesn't end here. We carry on with the discussion. And thank you again for joining us today. And I wish you and your family very well for this very exciting, that was in quotation marks, school year. Thanks a lot.